Let's take the issue of organizational culture. To me, that's pretty much at the top of the list. There are many organizations that have a culture that supports and stimulates and nurtures learning. A culture that basically says it's okay for us to make mistakes. They write that kind of stuff into their grant proposals. They're frank with funders about their learning agenda. They're frank with each other. They talk about what's not working. They talk about what is working. They're focused on really learning from what they're doing. That type of a culture, of course, is ripe for the use of new tools and technologies. Conversely, of course, we know that there are organizations that have a culture that's more restrictive, a culture that maybe is more egocentric and driven by a single person. Maybe the organization has a culture that doesn't value different ways of doing things. In other words, there is a right and a wrong way. We need to find out what the quote-unquote best practice is, as opposed to what are the effective practices that many are using. I think particularly with Web 2.0 technologies and strategies, this organizational culture issue is central. Why? Because implicit in the use of these tools and strategies is the ability and the interest in increasing the connections between people, between us and our constituents, maybe constituent to constituent. And by the very nature of that reality, in other words, it's about increasing connectivity between people, we need to know that the organization needs to know that it's really committed to what's important when you're talking about that. And that is really about listening and learning and meeting people where they are on their ground. And so I think organizational culture, we will find, plays an increasing role in determining whether or not organizations are successful in deploying these kinds of tools. A second area in relation to application of Web 2.0 technologies is in the area of leadership. And I think some of this you'll find mirrors what I'm saying about organizational culture. Leadership is a critical component of success in organizations related to a whole wide variety of things, of course. But when it comes to innovation, when it comes to the use of technology, I think what we find is that organizations that have strong leadership, and when I say strong, I don't necessarily mean leadership that's autocratic per se or authoritarian, but strong leadership in that the leadership in the organization, whether it's a CEO, whether it's the board, whether it's senior management, that the leadership in the organization values staff taking risks. They value staff trying new things. They value staff who have their hands on the pulse of constituents or have their hands on the pulse of the use of tools, being able to come in and educate them about what is possible. If we see leadership that is the type of leadership that asks questions as opposed to making pronunciations of what needs to happen or doesn't need to happen, basically, if we see a type of open leadership, a type of progressive leadership that values these things, I think we find an environment where the use of those Web 2.0 tools and strategies has an increased chance of actually being used both strategically, and then we see results, outcomes that are desired. And so we also have the issue of capacity. When we talk about capacity, I tend to think about a variety of things. I think about time. Do we have the time to devote to experimentation? Do we have the time to devote to looking at the results, to see what it is we've learned, and to then adjust from there to maybe deploy things in a different way? I think that that is necessary when using technology because there are impacts. There are impacts within the organization. There are impacts for stakeholders. So it's really important to kind of create what a lot of us talk about is a feedback loop, so that we're constantly gathering and thinking about information that comes from our stakeholders, information that maybe comes from other organizations, our partners, information that comes from other staff that we're working with in the organization. So finding the time to do that, of course, is central, and I think it's an important filter when looking at the use of this stuff, trying to determine should we or shouldn't we. I think another interesting question about capacity, of course, is money. And many organizations will cry poor. They don't have the money to buy new technology. They don't have the money to buy the expertise to use it, etc., etc. And though that is valid in many situations, one of the things that we're learning as we see these Web 2.0 tools hit the market is a lot of them are very low cost. And it doesn't take a lot of knowledge to use them. And so the barriers of technology that we used to be faced with are actually starting to kind of dissipate. And as they dissipate, they're creating opportunities for us to enter into the use of these tools with a little bit less hesitancy. But I guess the basic bottom line for me is it's really time that we stop reinvention of the same dysfunction when it comes to applying ICT, information communication technologies, particularly now in relation to Web 2.0. And that's because these very technologies that we're seeing emerge, sharing of photos, easier use of video, mapping, both these technologies and the integration of them and the layering of them, what some people call the mashing together of them or mashing them up, is becoming very powerful. And at such low cost and such low levels of expertise needed to use a lot of these tools, the range of possibilities in front of us are incredible. And of course, that's what we hear about from the pundits, and that's what we hear about from the techies and that are really interested in technology, and that's what we hear about from the activists out there who are using these tools with such fantastic results quite often. What we're not hearing about enough is what are the questions that you as an organization need to ask yourself as you dive in. And that's where I think we're making a mistake, is we're not asking enough questions. Now, let me finish by just saying that I'm not proposing to you that you end up in an endless cycle of analysis paralysis. I am actually proposing, in fact, that you use these filters I've been talking about to ascertain what are the tolerance levels in your organization for experimentation. I'm proposing to you that you approach the use of Web 2.0 from an experimental mindset. And you basically say to yourself, we're going to try this out. And you map out small experiments, the kinds of things that you can handle and that you can digest and that you can then review and determine whether or not it should be applied in an ongoing fashion, should it be scaled up, or we should just cut the use of this thing. We really are not ready. We're not in a position right now to do it. My frustration is that we're making the same mistakes. We're in a moment in time right now where there's an enormous amount of excitement in relation to the use of technology because of Web 2.0. But if there's one thing about Web 2.0 that isn't different, is that it is prompting us to make the exact same mistakes that we've made over the years in relation to the application of other tools and other strategies. So, with that in hand, I'll sign off right now, and I hope you take the lesson learned here, which is think, experiment, learn. Ciao.